Okay, so I started the year off in Thailand. We did our countdown in Hua Hin. And the first book I read was Sally Rooney's latest, Beautiful World, Where Are You? Rooney, again, managed to paint an authentic word portrait of very specific people that somehow managed to feel broadly relatable. Next up, Calypso by David Sedaris, a perfectly digestible book full of anecdotes and humour, which is exactly what I needed while I was working a 7-day-a-week editing job. Somehow, finding time to look at my Kobo screen while taking a break from my MacBook screen, I read The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, a twisty-turny, historically accurate novelization of the making of the Chicago Fair intercut with a narcissistic serial killer going on his haunts. I read this between working and swimming at a 5-star hotel pool. Poor me. Honeybee by Craig Silver was next, a Beatty type of book. It opened on an attempted suicide by a kid we quickly discovered to be trans. It was recommended by a good friend, so I stuck with it, and I was glad I did. It was touching and painful. Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. Doerr? Historical fiction with a touch of surrealist fantasy. Very much enjoyed that while I was drinking Starbucks in the rain. Chinko by Hayden J. Oh, right up my alley. And soon hitting screens as a series adaptation. It was immense, epic, sprawling, heartbreaking. It was a bit disturbing to be reading about times of great cultural upheaval and how humanity is balancing on a knife's edge while this was going on back home. Hereby follows a series of reads that didn't really set me on fire. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, The End of Time, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, The Code Breaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race. But again, I was here, so I'm not complaining. Now I leave Bangkok and we're travelling to the islands, and I managed to stumble across The Bone Clocks, a fantastic piece of surrealist historical fiction by David Mitchell, 5 stars. Charlie heads back to New Zealand, so I have a lot of time to myself, which means a lot of reading. I start the clever and funny sci-fi series Bobbyverse by Dennis E. Taylor, starting with number 1, We Are Legion. Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. I read this while I was in Ko Chang because Chai Ling loves it. It's cute and touching. I touched down in Chiang Mai and I have delicious food and I start reading One of Us is Lying. The TV series got made in New Zealand, I think. I loved it. Teenage drama mixed with mystery. What's not to like? To Paradise, the highly anticipated epic from Hanya Yanagihara. Messy, intellectual, great, but not great enough for a lot of people. The Christie Affair by Nina de Grammont. Old school style mystery. I read this while meeting snakes and sugar gliders, which have now become my favorite animal, second only to humans. Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkinson, a family drama. I read this while hanging out with elephants in the mountains. The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley, more mystery. I read this while getting sunburnt, but again, not complaining. I read this on Koh Tao and Koh Phangan. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Okay, so this took ages to get through because I wasn't really enjoying it. Wakers, a young adult sci-fi by Orson Scott Card. Meh. I get to Sydney, get to hang out with my awesome sister, and I read The Candy House by Jennifer Egan, a book that's kind of hard to condense into a sentence. It has historical fiction, family drama, a touch of surrealist sci-fi, but it reads like a contemporary fiction. And it's time to improve myself by reading Michael Schur's How to Be Perfect, an approachably written book about philosophy. Artemis by Andy Weir. Humans have colonized the moon, and there's a rough and ready, smart-ass, street-smart chickie babe who's getting into amusing scrapes. Loved it. Lots of fun. I go out for dinner with some best pals and bang, COVID gets me. Thanks, Tim. And that means a lot of being horizontal. David Mitchell comes back into my life with Utopia Avenue, an electrifyingly entertaining biography about a fictional band in London in the 60s. Salem's Lot by Stephen King and Magpie Murders by Anthony Horowitz round off my sickness nicely. I throw in The Grey Man for good measure because I'm excited about the upcoming film. The Giver, the first in Lois Lowry series about a dystopian future, blows my hair back, so I chow through the sequels, Gathering Blue, Messenger, and Sun, and then board a plane to the other side of the world to visit friends. While flying, I read The Stranger by Albert Camus, and the second Bobbyverse book, For We Are Many. Managed to rip through The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, and I'm feeling suitably existential by the time I arrive in London and see Kendall. While being in my 30s in London with friends and wondering about what I'm doing with my life, I read Expectation by Anna Hope, a book about a group of friends in their 30s in London wondering what they're doing with their life. I go to Malta, then Santorini, then Sicily, all the while reading Washington Black by Essie Adugyang. It takes me on a wild ride with a black slave boy who traverses the world on a series of adventures, and it blows my mind further when I found out it's based on real events and a real person. In Mallorca, the friend I'm meant to meet gets COVID, so I spend the whole trip reading the 1,200-page unabridged version of The Stand by Stephen King and fearing the end of the world. After that, I need a palate cleanser, so a rom-com it is. If I Never Met You by Mari McFarlane, and I'll read this while eating kebabs alone. I'm feeling like a gentleman flying back to London. So I read A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towns, and even though the language is cute and clever, I'm bored. Girl A lifts me out of my boredom and reminds me I should be endlessly grateful I wasn't held captive by my own father. Back in Thailand, I Get Amongst One of Us Is Next by Karen M. McManus, a great sequel to One of Us Is Lying. Keep that vibe going with the latest Cormoran Strike book, Ink Black Heart by Robert Galbraith, which is super long and super good and perfect for my flight home. Inspired by London, I'm determined to bike everywhere and catch public transport whenever I can, so I ride the train to work every day and I read Earthlings by Suyaka Murata. It's weird as hell. All These Worlds, which is the third book in the Bubblyverse series, and Insatiable by Daisy Buchanan, a raunchy yet annoying book about group sexual dynamics. The weather in spring in New Zealand wasn't very spring-like, and catching the train and being shouted out on my bike by Auckland motorists put me in the mood to read Sorrow and Bliss by Neg Mason, and then The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. They were both kind of just meh. Friends, Lovers, and The Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry was a breath of fresh air and humour despite the crushingly heavy subject matter. I tore through it in 2 days. I read Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. It's a great non-fiction book about how to tell stories. And Upgrade by Blake Crouch, a great sci-fi book about what could happen if we tried to upgrade the human genome. Woo-wee! I managed to read 50 books this year. Some of them were hefty, but most of them were in the 300 to 400 page range. And there were also some that I didn't finish, including really well-regarded books like Blonde, The Maid, White Noise, They Will Drown in Their Mother's Tears. I tried my best to read authors that span the globe, and I also managed to do 50% female authors, 50% male authors. My pages read per hour steadily increased throughout the year, and the average rating I gave books was on the high side. Most of the books I read were published in the last couple of years, and they were all from a smattering of different genres. If I could only recommend one book from the whole year, it would have to be Chinko, because that was the only book that brought me to tears. Alright, thanks for watching, and happy reading in 2023.